My name is Emily Kane Miller. If you heard what I heard, you would never forget.
If you heard what I heard. This podcast shares the powerful stories of Holocaust survivors, told by their grandchildren, the last generation to ever hear Holocaust survivor stories firsthand. So join me as we listen, learn, and remember. Together, we can make sure the world will never forget so that it never happens again.
I am the granddaughter of two Holocaust survivors. Today, I'll be sharing the story of my paternal grandmother, Yetta Kane. I call her Bubby. My Bubby was born December 28, 1932, in a very small shtetl called Miadzol. At the time, it was in Poland. It's now in modern-day Belarus. She was born to Adla Istran and Zelik Istran are the names of her parents, and she had two older brothers, Herman and Morris. She was born into a really tight-knit family. Many of her cousins and her grandparents lived in the same shtetl where she was raised. The family had a farm, but her father also had a little mercantile store connected to their property. And he would sell things like wool and sugar and coffee. And so their house was a place with a lot of buzz and a lot of commerce because people were constantly coming back and forth from the house because they were coming to buy things from Zelik's store. My Bubby would tell stories about being a farm girl. That's what she called herself. She had chores every day. She would feed the chickens. She was able to have lots of animals. Her best friend was her horse, which she would talk about riding without a saddle all over her community. And that was just part of a natural part of her childhood. Her mother was an incredible cook. So she spent a lot of time with her mother in the kitchen. They would make butter. They would make cheese. Of course, for all the holidays and for Shabbat, they would spend a lot of time preparing challah and customary food. Her childhood was filled with a lot of time outdoors, a lot of time in the kitchen, and a lot of time with family. The way that my Bubby describes their family's religious practice is that they were mitnagdim. So they were Orthodox, but not in a traditional way that you would think about an Orthodox person today with, specific garb or a beard. They looked and wore the same clothes as contemporary people in their village, but they were very strict on keeping Shabbos, keeping holidays, keeping kosher. It's not exactly how we would consider an Orthodox family in today's world, but they considered themselves Orthodox, certainly. And the synagogue that they attended was Orthodox in practice. Because my Zeta had this general store in their home, he needed to go every week to Vilnius. That was the closest town to the town that my Bubby was raised. Every Saturday night after Shabbat was over, he would get his horse together. He would get his cash together for all the things he was going to buy in the big city. He would go and buy them and come home. Sometime in 1939, after the Nazis invaded Poland, we know that they made their way to Miadzol. Because my great-grandfather was had this general store, he was going back and forth to Vilnius. And as the war was getting worse, he was hearing more and more stories in the bigger city about what was going on in communities across Europe. So when the Germans came to Miadzol, he, along with all of the other families, were told, come to the synagogue. We're having a meeting with all of the Jewish men from the community. And, we'll tell you what's going to happen next now that we're here and we're in charge. My great-grandfather, Zelik, said, this doesn't smell right to me. I can picture my Bubby telling me the story. This doesn't smell right to me, he said to my great-grandmother, Adla. And he didn't go. And of course, unfortunately, as history panned out, the Germans indeed took everybody into the synagogue, rounded them up, had them build a mass grave, and murdered everybody who went to that meeting that night. And my great-grandparents and their family lost many family members that evening. And my Bubby often talks about how she heard after the fact that the ground shook for days because people didn't die right away. And it, still, I can hear her tell it, and it still is so present and real for her. My Zeta and his 3 kids and my Bubby all ran into the woods, not really knowing what they were going to do next, but knowing that they had survived the first thing that they needed to survive to keep their family intact. It was one of these situations where they had nowhere to go but the forest. Obviously, they were now wanted people, and any Jews that were going to be seen in their shtetl were going to be captured and either killed or put into camps. My great-grandfather, Zeta Zelik, had a cousin named Jacob Sagalchik. Sagalchik is a fairly famous member of the Miadzol Jewish community now because he was really known for creating a caravan of partisans that were in the woods, making their way toward Russia, making their way toward the Allies through, crazy territory, snow, freezing rivers, mountains, animals, all sorts of, natural hardships. And also with the Germans on their heels, they were shot at, they were chased by dogs. There was nothing that wasn't scary and terrifying about this experience, whether it was from the elements or from the Nazis. So this group of partisans, this ragtag army in the middle of the forest was the group that my great grandfather joined with to save his life, his wife's life, and his three children's lives. So the details related to them joining up with the partisans are, fairly vague. I know that the night that the Germans asked everybody to come to the synagogue was, obviously a devastating evening. And by the next morning, they were out in the woods. My bubby often would share they had the clothes on their back, and that was essentially it. Um, there were two bands in the partisans. Obviously, you had the people who were strong, able bodied men, and their priority was fighting the Germans, although they didn't have the coordination of an army. Anytime they had a chance to blow up a railway or steal ammunition or just create havoc and nuisance, they would do that. And that was that team's priority. And then there were all of these women and children. They were not fit to fight. They needed to be separated from the fighters so that they didn't, hold them back or potentially create a liability where the Germans found them because of, all of these families. And so my Zeta and Bubby, my great Zeta and Bubby and their children were in that family caravan. The two caravans needed to communicate to each other because they helped one another with food and with resources and with information. And even though they weren't physically connected, they were, a team. And so my bubby, who had blonde hair and looked like she could have been a Polish girl, was one of the young girls, and she couldn't have been more than 7 or 8 at this time, was one of the young girls who would carry messages back and forth between the family caravan and the fighting caravan. And she would be told, take this letter. You'll see a man who's wearing a black scarf at this cemetery. Give this note to him. If anybody stops you, only speak Polish to them and come back as soon as you're done with this errand. And that was one of her, roles in this work. And nobody cared that she was 7 years old. She had a job to do, and she was helping the survival of this group of people and the mission of this group of people, which was to fight the Germans whenever they could. There's no question that her life was at risk when she was doing this work. I don't know if she was aware of that, how dangerous it was. I think of my own daughter who's only 4.5. It's younger than 7, but it's not that much younger than 7. I can't imagine the decisions and the courage that my bubby needed to have during those years, but she had it. One story that has become part of our family legend, when my family was caravanning in the partisans, they came upon a family that had a Torah with them. The family who had it originally didn't have the strength to continue to carry the Torah. And my Zeta Zelik, who was a religious person and a deeply spiritual person, said, we'll take the Torah. And as my bubby has told us so many times, whenever it seemed like it couldn't be done, that they couldn't take the Torah another mile, that they were too weak or it was too cold or it was too scary, he would say to his family, I'm not carrying the Torah is carrying me. And they made it all the way to Siberia carrying that Torah, and it's now here in America and survived just like our family survived. Once they were able to get to Russia, to the Allied border, and miraculously survive the woods and the elements and the Germans, they were met with Allied forces who identified that they were now refugees, which was an amazing miracle that they got out of the Nazis' grasp. And now they were in another place of unknowing. They were able to communicate. They spoke a lot of languages. They spoke Russian. They were lucky. But it still was a place they had no family, no roots, no resources. They had not a dollar to their name. There were these, starving people who had just emerged from the woods. And as my bubby said, we looked like animals. Like they hadn't bathed, they hadn't shaved. She said you wouldn't recognize that we were just, people from a good family. At the time, and I don't know which agency they connected with, but essentially they had a choice to go to two different refugee camps. They were given the choice to either go to Siberia or Kurdistan or Uzbekistan. And my great grandfather, who didn't know much about either geographic area, said, "Tell me about the weather in these places." And they said, "Well, in Siberia, it's freezing all the time. It's always snowing. In Kurdistan, it's hot, hot, hot. And, it's a desert." And my great grandfather said, "We'll freeze in Siberia, but so will all of the Gehinnom, like the lice, like the plagues, like the things that could hurt us and kill us with disease. If we're freezing in Siberia, and those things will freeze in Siberia too, and they won't be able to get us. So maybe we'll be cold, but we'll be alive." And it's interesting. He was right. And a lot of the families that went into that other refugee camp didn't survive because they were exposed to things like malaria. And while my great grandfather didn't have a formal education, he was a pretty wise man to make the choices he made. Zelek and Adla and their three children at the time made their way to the displaced persons camp in Siberia, where they were allowed to live. And they were given a sheltered place to sleep, but that was about it. They had work, they had chores, they were given rations for food that were not enough. And while they were grateful to be alive, it wasn't an easy existence. My Bubby tells a story about how her brothers had a job to go and bring butter to various places along the route. And they actually would take just little bits of butter and put it in their pocket when they could, when it wouldn't be noticed. And my Bubby's convinced that it's that butter that was extra calories in their diet that allowed them to survive. And that without those little extra bits of butter and those little extra bits of things here and there, it wouldn't have been enough to make it through that time in their lives. She still talks about this food that her mother would make in the DP camps, where she would go. One of their jobs was to feed the pigs. And part of the food that the pigs would get were sort of like leftovers and, bread and grains and other things that the people from the community had, were essentially their garbage. And Bubby Aba would skim the top of the water that was going into the troughs and collect all of the little pieces of bread and leftovers and grains. And she would make them into these little patties and fry them in that butter. And my Bubby can still feel the crunch, she would say. She could still taste the crunch of what at the time tasted like the most delicious thing any of them had ever eaten, even though it was trash, because that's what kept them alive. When I think about all of the decisions that Zelek, my great grandfather, needed to make, probably around the age that I am now, and all of the right decisions that he made at the right time, I'm just in awe. It took a lot of luck, and certainly that's a big part of it, but it took a lot of sechel in Yiddish. It took a lot of wisdom. And it's a miracle that he survived, but it's a miracle that he kept this nuclear family intact the whole way. So one story that just blows my mind, because I can't imagine being this refugee family, having no food, not being certain about what was happening next. My great grandparents got pregnant in the displaced persons camp, of all things, which I think is just such a beautiful metaphor for life and for hope and for renewal. My great grandmother got pregnant with my great aunt, whose name is Sarah Freuda. She was named after my great great grandmother, who was killed by the Nazis in Miadzol. And she was the embodiment of their family's belief that there was going to be a tomorrow. My Bubby Adla had two sisters who had immigrated to the United States before the war. She had been in contact with them, of course, before the war to see if they could help get her family out. That was not successful, unfortunately, but she was able to get back in touch with them from the DP camp from Siberia. Her sisters reached out and said, "Of course, we'll sponsor you. Thank God you're alive. We thought you were dead. This is a miracle." And they figured out how to make this all happen. Part of their journey to get to the United States was that they needed to go to Germany. They actually stopped in Miadzol. They stopped back in Poland. I think they were trying to figure out, is there a life here for us? Should we see if we can stay in Europe? They were not met with open arms. Their neighbors, who had formerly lived in peace with them, turned on them almost immediately. New people were living in their homes, and they didn't think that my grandparents had survived and had no intention or plans to give the family their resources back. It was very clear that they were not well received. There were definitely guns involved where they were being pointed at my family and told under no certain terms that if they didn't leave immediately, they would all be dead. And my great grandparents said we didn't survive everything we survived and go through this hell to die in Miadzol after the war. And so they made their way to Germany to a DP camp there while they waited to get ship passage from the aunts who were in America and work through all those details. In 1949, they were able to get the paperwork and the tickets and, all of the things together that you needed to have to immigrate to the United States. And they made their way to Los Angeles by rail and were met by my bubby's family, her two aunts, and one of those aunts had a daughter who was a bit older than my bubby and who had children who were a bit younger than my bubby. And that family really embraced my bubby and her family. They had a little apartment in Los Angeles that they had been able to rent for them. They had dishes, they had clean sheets, they had food. And it was the first time since the war had broken out a decade before that my bubby slept in a bed in clean sheets with a full belly and felt safe. And she knew that when she got to Los Angeles, that her life had started. So in Germany, my bubby was lucky because ORT, which is an organization that still exists today, had provided training for her so that she could learn to sew. And you have to remember, by the time the war was over, my bubby was a teenager. And when the war started, she was a little girl. She hadn't gone to school. She could read and these sorts of things, but she didn't have a formal education. And so ORT gave her a chance to learn a trade, and that trade was sewing. When they got to the United States and she and her nuclear family settled into this apartment, her younger sister, who was just a girl, was enrolled in school. And she and her older brothers and her father found work so that they could support the family and start building their lives over. And so Bubby was able to find a job as a seamstress, first in a factory. And I think she was happy to have the work, but it wasn't, an amazing setting. And her next job that she got, which was a much better situation, was sewing lingerie, very fancy lingerie for all sorts of well-to-do people in Los Angeles, including actresses. Still to this day, if she needs something hemmed or, I have a pair of jeans that I need hemmed, she'll happily do it. She has a sewing machine and still enjoys using it even now. My bubby and her brothers attended a refugee dance not long after they got to the United States. I think it was in 51 in Los Angeles. And at that refugee dance, there was a man named David J. Kane. He was also a refugee, also Polish, but from a more urban community. He was from a town called Benjin. And as they tell the story, they saw each other, walked across the dance floor. He asked her to dance and they were in love. And by the end of the dance, he tried to kiss her on the cheek and she slapped him and walked away and thought that he was fresh. And lucky for me and for our whole family, he persisted and asked her out on a proper date. I think her brother chaperoned or something along those lines. And the rest is history. She was still very young, and my grandfather was a really practical person. He had a mind for business. He knew that he needed to study, and he got a degree at a community college in accounting and ended up becoming a cantor. So he had all of these things, these plans that he needed to line up. And she told him, go do that. I'm going to keep making money. I'm yours. You're mine. And about a year later in 1952, they married. He was already a chaplain at this point in the Army and a practicing cantor in the Army. And they went to Fort Ord, where they started their marriage and their life together. And then once he was done with his service, made their way back to the Los Angeles area, and he got a job at his first synagogue in Monterey Park, which is where my dad and my aunt were born. I think my bubby's survival really hinged on three elements. The first one was her family. Obviously, the fact that she was surviving the war with her nuclear family made an incredible difference in her strength and belief in her ability to persevere. And I think was just an incredible resource for her on that path. The second is definitely her faith. She is somebody who unequivocally believes in God and has always believed in God, even in the darkest of times. And I think that she felt like she had a higher power to pray to and to believe in and to call out in these moments. And she never severed her connection with God during the Holocaust. And has certainly, I think even in tough times contemporaneously, still very focused on that relationship with God and like her Jewish identity and spirituality. And the last piece is that she is just a tough lady. She's mentally tough. She's physically tough. And I think she sees herself as somebody who's going to survive. And so she survived. I don't think that she ever questioned whether there would be life after the war. I think she just didn't know what it was going to look like. And I think she was unwavering in her belief that she was going to make it. I always knew that my grandparents were from Europe. They had accents. They cooked different food. They smelled different. And I knew that European Jews who were in their age survived the Holocaust. So conceptually, I understood this was part of our family story. But it wasn't until the 1990s when my grandparents participated in the Shoah Foundation tapes that Steven Spielberg helped to organize, where they cataloged and told their stories over many hours with interviews there, that I think they even thought about sharing the stories with us. My dad says, who obviously has known them a lot longer than I have, and my aunt and my uncle, when they started talking with us, with the grandkids about it in the 90s, he heard things that he had never heard that, their generation had ever heard growing up. So it really was this G3, when we were 10, almost, 10 to kind of 13, like bar mitzvah age, that my grandparents, I think it was this confluence of events of they were far enough away from the experience that they had a little bit more distance than when their kids were young. They had just done the tapes with Steven Spielberg and had told the stories to strangers. And they realized that their family had a knowledge gap that we as their kin knew less than the people who had interviewed them through the Shoah Foundation. We were at a Passover Seder at my grandparents' house, and they sat us down. It was my cousins and my brothers and my aunts and uncles and my parents and I. And through the lens of the Passover story, they started telling us our family story in ways that I don't necessarily remember the details, but I remember the feeling of these people who I loved so much and understanding in a way that I had never understood before the amount of pain and suffering that they had experienced at the hands of the Nazis. And on that night, I think it was really the introduction of what would become for me a lifetime of wanting to hear those stories and understand them better. Every time my grandparents and my bubby specifically tell their story, my bubby would say it was like taking a Band-Aid off of a very old wound and pushing it. It's not that she remembered that it was there every single minute. She had a lot of joy and a lot of beauty in her life, and she was able to focus on those joyful and beautiful things. But as soon as she would begin to share her family's experience and sort of put herself back in a place where she could really tell the story, it was painful the same way that it was painful the day that it was happening. And so for me, I always wanted to make sure that when we asked her stories, or we asked her for stories, or we asked her to tell us, that we were in a place where we could really benefit from her telling it, because it wasn't something that I wanted her to experience unless we were really able to like be there and engage and listen. My biggest lesson as the grandchild of Holocaust survivors is that I don't take anything for granted. There's no such thing as, a certainty or a guarantee. And I think that I am constantly living my life in a way that tries to hold in two hands the reality that nothing is guaranteed, but also that life is beautiful. And to be somebody who can appreciate when things are good, but also be prepared for the tides changing. We as individuals have a responsibility today to think about this banner of never again, but really make it true. My husband and I have two kids. They're 2.5 and 4.5. They're really little. My daughter is named for my Zeta. She's the 4.5-year-old, and neither of them understand what the Holocaust is or the atrocities that occurred during the Holocaust, but they do know that their great grandparents or from Europe. And, you know, we've hinted at this idea that life was hard and that they came to America to start a new life. Um, and the reason that at a really, young age, when we talked with my daughter about the fact that she's named for my Zeta and who he was, and that he was this incredibly miraculous person and he had a hard life, is that I really want her to understand and have like built into the core of her DNA. And this is as much a part of who she is as, her cheekbones and her hair. I hope that the understanding around the Holocaust and a passion for Holocaust education is a part of who my kids are. My my goal would be that they feel like this is their story, that it's a part of their responsibility to continue to tell our family story and to tell the broader story of the Shoah and of the Jewish community's experience from the Holocaust. I hope they can see that by connecting to this story, that it doesn't always need to be sad. It can also be empowering, and that they take that baton and build a life of purpose. So growing up as the grandkid of Holocaust survivors, it's always been very clear to me that we are miraculous. The fact that I am here in Los Angeles, alive with a Jewish household and Jewish children is a miracle, like, period. And that has really been a cornerstone of how I see myself, the choices that I make in my life, the kinds of decisions that I try to make from a career perspective, the way that I exist in the world as a citizen, all runs through this lens of needing to be a powerful force for good in the world and for the Jewish community. Because we have a lot of people to make up for who were murdered, and that there's this sense of like obligation that like I have to be 50 times bigger than I would otherwise need to be because I'm standing in the shoes of people who aren't here. When you see those parts of the family tree that disappeared on the sad side. But on the powerful side, that's such an opportunity to see yourself as being bigger than you are. It gives you the belief that you can do anything and that what you do matters. And that sense of purpose is inextricably linked from my understanding of what it means to be a grandchild of survivors. And I'm really grateful for it. So while my Bubby and her nuclear family were lucky to survive, they lost so many members of their family. The vast majority of the people who they grew up with, who were their relatives, were murdered by the Nazis. If I could communicate to my family that perished in the Holocaust, and we had family on my Bubby's side, the story that I just told you, but I had many more relatives who died on my Zeta's side. He and his dad were the only ones who survived from their entire family. Especially if I could speak to my Bubby Bryna, his mother, and his sister Pearl, I would want them to know that they are so loved, that they're remembered, and that their family is doing everything they can to honor their memory and to make sure that they would be proud of the people who were able to continue their line and that they would recognize us. I would want them to know that the way of life that they stood for and the values that they held are being held on to today. For my Bubby and both of my grandparents, I think it was very important that their children and grandchildren knew their story, and that we continued to help keep their story alive. My grandparents in the later part, my Bubby is still with us. My Zeta is gone. And for, 25 years together, and now she on her own, they go and tell the story at schools all over Southern California, because they believe that it's their responsibility to make sure that people, many of whom have never met a Jewish person before they take the stage, that people know about our family story, but also the story of the Holocaust more generally. And so I think they have created an amazing way of communicating their family experience, but through the broader lens of the Holocaust, as a way to educate folks. And so I think my Bubby would say it is critical that her family, both shares and continues to share the family story, but also shares the story of Zashella more broadly. I am so lucky because my bubby is still with us. As I record this, I can call her and tell her how it went, which is just such a blessing. Um, there are so many things that I love about her. And if she were sitting next to me and I was telling her, I would tell her, I love her leadership. She's a badass. Like Bubby is just like hands down one of the toughest, coolest, smartest people that I know. She's, maybe 5 feet tall if she's lying and super petite. So she's got this like tiny package and this big boom. And you just know that she's there and you know that she's in your corner and you know that she didn't come to play, like that lady, she plays for keeps, right? Like uh, she really believes in her purpose as a human, as a Jew, as a parent, as a grandparent. Like she's not passive. She's there for a reason and she's going to tell you about it. And you may not like it or you may not like the advice, but like it's said with love and with a lot of intentionality. And I have just always thought she was one of the coolest people that I've ever been able to know. She like is in me. Like I feel her in my brain and in my heart and in my soul. And the fact that she is able to not only be that person for me, but for, I know that my brothers and cousins feel this way. Like she's just such a deeply loving person who has been able to fan out her love and attention to so many people and have them feel as special as I know she makes me feel is an incredible gift. And certainly, is a matriarch of our family and somebody who I, you know, hope that I can continue to grow into the mold of because she's the best.
Thank you for listening to If You Heard What I Heard. If you'd like to learn more about our work and support our mission to make sure the world never forgets, please visit our website, ifyouheardwhatiheard.com. We will never let these stories be lost. It is the job of our generation to make sure future generations never forget so that it never happens again.